Good morning and welcome to the Sojourner Sunday School class. It's good to see more people in the classroom than last week. And I think last week was a few more than the previous week. So it's a good sign for all of us that we're able to feel a little bit freer about coming out. Good to see you all. Are there any announcements that need to be made? Okay, we're delighted to welcome AMBS Professor Susannah Larry. She has, first of all, her academic background. She did a bachelor's degree at Furman University, MTS at Vanderbilt, and a PhD at Vanderbilt. And I'm going to read, with her permission, just briefly from her faculty website. Susannah Larry came to know Mennonites while volunteering at Jubilee Partners, a Christian service community in Georgia, where she gained appreciation for Anabaptist commitments to justice and reconciliation, and where her interest in becoming a biblical scholar was sparked. She joined the AMBS faculty in 2020, having taught courses at Vanderbilt Divinity School and Sewanee School of Theology on Hebrew Bible, New Testament, Biblical Hebrew, confronting sexualized violence in the Bible, and feminist theology and biblical interpretation. At AMBS, she sees herself living into a ministry of teaching and scholarship that uplifts marginalized voices and empowers students with the knowledge and tools to reclaim the Bible as a life-giving word in their diverse ministry contexts. She says she has 3 children, 5 and under, and is a very busy mother and professional. Susannah, welcome. I'd like to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here with you all this morning. Thank you for your warm hospitality. This is my first time in College Mennonite Church, and I am so delighted to be here in person and to see you all and to be joining others online. I'm a fairly newcomer person to Northern Indiana, having grown up in Georgia and spent most of my young adult life in Tennessee. So I am still learning the ways of the Midwest, still learning the ways of Mennonites, but I have really, really loved my time here so far, and I'm just so delighted to be here and meet all of you. So my presentation today is on the subject of my book, which is Leaving Silence, Sexualized Violence, the Bible, and Standing with Survivors. I published this book with Herald Press in 2021, about a week after it had been announced that I was coming to AMBS as a new professor. Herald Press reached out to me and asked me if I would like to write a book on this subject. And I said, well, why not? But I recognize at the same time that this is not the easiest of topics. For many of us, we have personally experienced things in this area, whether men or women, whether in our 30s or in our 90s, these experiences remain really emotionally salient. So I invite you to attend to your own well-being and participate as feels appropriate to you in this time and space.
We're getting an echo. Do you have your?
Let's see. I do not have it on.
This might make a difference.
Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties here. It's one of the joys and challenges of the COVID/post-COVID era. So first off, I wanted to define a little bit what I mean when I say sexualized violence. So what you might wonder, why am I saying sexualized violence, not sexual violence? Well, what I'm trying to do by using this particular term is to demonstrate that sex itself or sexuality is not inherently the problem. I think as Christians, many of us carry a lot of baggage around sexuality, things that we might have heard or learned growing up. But I think what I want to emphasize is that sexuality itself is a gift from God. And of course, we as humans can distort it in problematic ways. But our sexuality is one of the ways that we are created and in God's image and bear God's image. So using the term sexualized violence, I mean to show that it is not sex itself that's the problem, but actions that appear to be sort of in this realm of sexuality are abused as a broader form, as sort of under the broader umbrella of abuse of power in order to harm people. So in this diagram here, I've shown what I see to be sort of two competing ways of thinking about sexualized violence. Sorry, I might have used some bad color choices here for visibility. In the way that more traditionally we might have thought about sexualized violence, we might see it as sort of an individualized pathology. In other words, somebody sort of marginal to our communities might have sort of a perversion or something wrong with them, some sort of psychological disturbance that leads them to commit these kinds of crimes. But in the ways that social scientists think about sexualized violence today, more commonly, they think about it as a social problem. In other words, social structures, attitudes, and practices create an environment, almost a network of relationships and power structures in which sexualized violence can prevail. So most commonly, sexualized violence occurs when there are differences in power between people. And I know as Mennonites, talking about power can kind of be an uncomfortable thing sometimes. We like to think about all of us sort of being seated around God's table in ways that are very egalitarian, that are very hospitable, so that we are equally exchanging ideas and power. But I think it's important to recognize that these differences of power are often still there. Sometimes it's that a person is in a position of higher authority. Sometimes aspects of a person's identity, like race or socioeconomic standing or gender, create these power differences. And in situations of differentials of power, sexualized violence often emerges. One of the ways that social scientists often describe the power differences that lead to sexualized violence is through this term rape culture. Rape culture is defined as a society that reproduces, transmits, and raises the risk of sexualized violence through its toxic attitudes and practices concerning this issue. There are a lot of characteristics of rape culture that may seem minor on their own, but together sort of create this system in which sexualized violence can occur so commonly. So some examples we might point to are victim blaming. You might hear if someone tells a story about having been raped, you might hear somebody ask something like, well, how much had you had to drink that night? As if drinking caused another person to make the terrible decision to commit this rape. Slut shaming, in which especially women are spoken about pejoratively for having engaged in sexual acts. Jokes that involve sexual assault. Sometimes you might hear these minimized as a locker room behavior, something like that, as we have in recent political cycles. Rigid constructions of gender are part of this as well. That women are seen as passive and men are active and aggressive. This very often plays into rape culture. And then finally, having a taboo around sex education so that children are not educated to correctly identify parts of their bodies, being able to define what healthy boundaries would be, and be able to confidently speak about when these things happen to them. So all of these aspects are parts of rape culture in our time and place. But what about the biblical world? Could we honestly say that the biblical world represents a rape culture as well? And unfortunately, even though there's a lot of time and space between our world and the biblical worlds, I think there are a lot of the same problems in the biblical world as there are today. So a few examples I want to point to from the Bible. In law codes, such as the Deuteronomic law in Deuteronomy 22, women who survived rape could be punished as adulteresses. The unequal power dynamics between men and women, but also slaves and free people, people who went to war and were conquered, and people who went to war and defeated. All of these played into the creation of power dynamics that allowed sexual assault to happen. The way that virginity is talked about and valued as a commodity, that you could put a numerical value on a woman's virginity, and this value belonged to her father and then to her husband, is something that played into it as well. And I forgot to mention this as part of contemporary rape culture, but we can sort of see some of the similar discourses around virginity in the ways that some Christian communities still talk about virginity and purity in ways that are very harmful to people who have experienced sexualized violence. Oftentimes in biblical texts, people who are less powerful are discouraged from speaking. We can see this in the pure silence and absence of so many women's voices, especially in biblical texts. And we can only assume that this replicates the ways that women lived and experienced society. As we all know, there are passages in the Bible that valorize violent images for God and sometimes even show God as someone who is committing sexual abuse and violence. And I'm thinking especially here of passages from the prophets like Hosea 1-2, which it's called the marriage metaphor, and it shows God as the husband and Israel and Judah as the unfaithful wife. And in retaliation for the disobedience of the wife, God's actions of abuse are seen to be justified. There's a huge theological thread throughout the Bible that if you're suffering, it must be because you have sinned. Sin leading to suffering, this direct causal connection between something bad happening to you because you've done something wrong. And we all know in life that it's way more complicated than that. Sometimes we do wrong things and we get our just desserts. Sometimes there's just no way to explain the bad stuff that happens. I have a friend whose 34-year-old husband has terminal brain cancer. No way to explain that based on his sin or his family's sin. And we all know this. So in short, so what I'm trying to say is that this get what you deserve mentality feeds into rape culture by making the claim that if you are experiencing something along the lines of sexualized violence, it must be because you have done something wrong first. So in short, there are many, many ways in which the Bible portrays a rape culture. So at this point in my talk, I know I start to feel a little despair, like this is still our sacred text. What are we supposed to do with all of this? Well, one of my favorite aspects of the Bible is that the Bible does not speak in one voice. It's what we call, in fancy academic language, polyphonic, many-voiced. And so there are lots of different ways that the Bible represents sexualized violence. And there are many moments of hope that feel really empowering to survivors of sexualized violence today, too. So for instance, what I did my PhD dissertation on was Lamentations, in which in the first couple of chapters, a woman's voice is shown to be speaking, and she laments many things, including a rape. She gives voice and protest to what's happening to her and her people. And somehow I had never read this text before I went to seminary. I don't think we celebrate these kind of texts enough in churches. In the Song of Songs, which is that wonderful classic love poetry of the Hebrew Bible, the female lover goes out at night. Whenever a woman goes out in the Bible, unfortunately, usually something bad follows happening to her. And she is stripped by the guards, and yet she remains a positive and desirable figure. Oftentimes, I think it's possible to read stories of sexual assault in the Bible as bearing witness in some ways to survivors' stories. Like, yes, these texts are really difficult to read and kind of horrible. And yes, it's very difficult that they're in our sacred text. And at the same time, the fact that these stories are there bears witness to the reality that people go through these things today, and people went through these things back in biblical times. And these things are all part of God's story and God's effort to reconcile the world. And so one of the places where I feel this particularly keenly is in 2 Samuel 13, which is the story of Tamar, who is the daughter of King David. So she's a princess, and she's raped by her half-brother Amnon. And she protests this. And I believe I actually have this, a little selection from this text here. She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? As for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." So the fact that the Bible gives voice to these kinds of protests is really powerful and hopeful to me. And then one other aspect that I think is crucial for us as Christians is that Jesus Christ, who is crucified and tortured in horrible ways on his way to the cross, himself is shown as a victim of sexualized violence. Now, I have frankly never heard this talked about, the story of Jesus's passion talked about in this way in all my years going to church. But if you look at the ways that Jesus was stripped and mocked again and again and hung on the cross naked, this very much reflects sexual abuse. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So does the Bible only represent rape culture? No, I think that there are powerful counter voices against sexualized violence and abuse that we need to pay attention to and use as resources more in our congregations. So I want to point out a few more aspects of how the Bible deals with sexualized violence. So my focus is in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, where the language is clearly Hebrew. And one of the interesting things about studying sexualized violence in the Bible is that there is no special specific word for rape or sexual abuse in the Bible. The word that is very often used is the Hebrew word inah. It very often appears in stories we might call rape stories in the Old Testament, like 1 Samuel 13, but it does not specifically mean rape. It has a bigger umbrella of meanings. It's used for oppression, humiliation, enslavement, and sexual assault. So, for example, when the Israelites were in Egypt, they were being inad by the Egyptians. And so that probably doesn't simply refer to sexualized violence, although we know that it was in fairly modern North America, as well as in ancient times, sexual assault was often a part of slavery. But it can also refer to the oppression of one people group by another. Inah has at its core meaning power, abuse of power. And I think that's really helpful to help us understand sexualized violence today. It's a question always of power. It's not really about sex, it's about power. The Old Testament very keenly and perceptively classifies sexualized violence among other crimes of power rather than an individual pathology. So one of the other really powerful aspects of how the Old Testament presents sexualized violence in the New Testament is that it spans gender identities. One of the biggest travesties, I think, and how we as a church collectively talk about sexualized violence is we often treat it as a women's issue. And that does a couple things that are not good. It puts the onus on women to fix it. And I feel like we all know women bear an unfair burden in a lot of ways, and this is just one of them. But it also silences men and boys who have experienced sexualized violence. So according to the most recent statistics, 1 in 3 women has experienced sexualized violence, which is a huge percentage. It might be even higher, but 1 in 6 men also has. This is not a women's issue. It's not a men's issue. It's a people's issue that we all need to come together and work on to fix. So one thing that I think is so powerful in how the Bible deals with sexualized violence is that it contains stories of men going through these things too. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah shows men being threatened with gang rape. The story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Joseph is a slave, and Potiphar's wife is a wealthy wife of an official, and she is abusing her position for control over Joseph. These verses of Leviticus, we could talk a lot more about these, 18:22 and 20:13. They say, don't lie with a man, literally in Hebrew, the lying of a woman, because it is an abomination. So typically these verses in Christian history from the medieval period onward, so we're not talking about the early church or anything like this. This is a later sort of invention. Use these verses to talk about homosexuality and to harm LGBT people. Well, I think that these voices are rather talking about abusing men by treating them as women are treated. So there's a lot of sort of embedded misogyny there, that the default for women is to be subordinate. But I think this is referring to abusing men by using sexualized violence to put them in their place as if they were a woman. And we know from records in Assyrian law codes that this is something that was very commonly done, for example, in war, where conquering men would rape defeated men. And this did not have to do with homosexuality, because there isn't even a word for homosexuality in the Bible. These contemporary constructs of sexuality are not something that there was really language for in the biblical world. But this is about abuse of power once again. And the Bible recognizes that men can be susceptible to abuse of power as much as women. The story of Samson is one that we could also talk about in terms of sexualized violence. That word, inah, that I was talking about, that's used to describe what happens between Samson and Delilah. And if you think about what happens in that story, Delilah and the Philistines are kind of systematically stripping Samson of power. And it doesn't seem out of reasonable belief that this could have a sexualized violence dimension. And then finally, as I mentioned, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Word made flesh, incarnate among us, experienced sexualized violence too. So all this, I think, is really, really important because for men, I think the stigma of talking about their experiences of sexualized violence is even greater than it is for women. Because oftentimes, the male survivors I know have waited a lot longer to come forward to anyone with their stories because they feel like if they share this information, they will be seen as less than male. And unfortunately, this is a fear with good grounding in the ways that we as a society respond. So I really think that we need to have more emphasis in our churches about this issue as being a people's issue, not merely a women's issue. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about Jesus, because I know we as Christians, as Mennonites, really like Jesus. So I wanted to explore a little bit, why don't we think about or talk about Jesus as being a survivor or a victim of sexualized violence more often? Well, I don't know if these are images. I didn't grow up Mennonite, as you may know. But I don't know if these are sort of images that have resonance for Mennonites. But for a lot of Christians, when we think about Jesus, we kind of think about a Superman. He conquers death. He is very muscled when he does that. He is stoic. He is impassive. He is everything that we construct a man to be. He is a manly man. And I think our transposition of these very rigid understandings of gender unto Jesus is one of the reasons that we never talk about him being a victim of sexual violence. We are so rigid in the ways that we think about sexual violence as being something that happens to women, that women deal with, that we're not able to see it, even in a story that we tell every year, like the story of Jesus' suffering and death. So, not sure how well you can see this, but this is a sculpture called Christa. And she has the body of a woman. So it's Jesus with a woman's body who is hanging completely naked on the cross. This sculpture was made by Edwina Sandys, who was actually the granddaughter of Winston Churchill, if you can imagine that. So back in 1984, which was several years before I was born, so I was not there to bear witness to this, she made this sculpture that was commissioned for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And she said that she made it like this as a naked woman to show Jesus's solidarity with the experiences of women who are sexually exploited. And she didn't extend this to men, but perhaps we could think about that as well. This was so controversial that it was taken down almost immediately. What is a naked woman doing in the cathedral, right? Especially this being the body of Jesus, supposedly. But more recently, this has been returned to display, and now I very much want to go find it and see it. I've never been to New York City, but I'd love to go. So I think there's maybe beginning to be a little bit more freedom for us to think about and talk about what it would mean to understand Jesus in this way. And I want to emphasize that this is not just something I'm making up as like this 31-year-old biblical scholar. This has really strong historical grounding. In the writings of Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who was roughly contemporary with Jesus, he talked about sexual abuse that the Romans were using against their prisoners. When men typically were crucified, they were intentionally posed on crosses so that their genitals would be more prominent as part of this terrible humiliation. And this is what Jesus experienced. Sexual abuse takes on many forms. It can be rape, but it doesn't have to be rape. Things like being looked at inappropriately, being stripped, being touched, all of these things are part of sexual abuse, and these are things that Jesus experienced. So when you think about Paul, I know that as good Mennonites, some of us probably have complicated feelings about Paul, but Paul talks about the scandal of the cross, and some contemporary New Testament scholars think that part of the scandal of the cross was that Jesus was actually sexually abused. Like, what a way to start a religious movement, right? If your leader is sexually abused. So I think that as we're in this season of Lent and Good Friday approaches, it might be worth it for us to think about how do we talk about Jesus's suffering and death in light of the reality that so many people in our churches have experienced sexualized violence. How much time do I have?
15 minutes.
50, oh my goodness, time flies when you're having fun, right? So I want to give just some suggestions for how do we talk about this better as a church? Because I know this is a group of really dynamic leaders, And I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned from my leadership going around to church groups like this and sharing about good ways to have these conversations and maybe some ways we should kind of avoid. So I'll do the bad stuff first, say the bad stuff first. So when we have these conversations, we don't want to assume that survivors are just out there in the abstract. We want to recognize that there are survivors in this room and probably in every room where you will have these conversations. When we're having these conversations, let's be careful. Let's not just share other people's stories. That can feel really exploitative to the people whose stories you're telling, and it might also be sort of activating for other survivors in the room. And I was using this at AMBS, so I have students, but people in your church, give choices. Don't require people who are participating to engage inflexibly. Give options. Let's not assume that if there are people in our group who have experienced sexualized violence, that they can't or shouldn't engage with these tough texts. Let's give that agency to the people who have experienced these things and let them make that decision for themselves. Let's not speak about survivors exclusively as women. Let's not treat survivors as just the objects of study. Let's not assume that there's one correct way for people to respond to their experiences, for example, by reporting to authorities, because that may not be possible or safe for different people. So here are the positives. Let's assume that there are people in this room who have experienced these things. Let's give warnings in advance of whatever event that we're going to engage subject matter that's very troubling and disturbing, so people can have the choice to do what's best for themselves and not come. Let's give choices for engagement. Let's not sort of compel people to share. Let's make sure people feel like they have agency in our spaces. Let's approach difficult texts as learning opportunities. Even if a text is really difficult, it might be powerful to someone because it reflects their experience in some way, and we don't want to dismiss that. Let's speak about survivors as spanning different identity groups, men and women. Whenever we can, let's find ways to center the voices, experiences, and knowledge of survivors who have the authority and competence to speak authoritatively about their experiences. And let's recognize that people respond to these things in all kinds of different ways. So some people will choose to report, some people won't. Some people will say things like, I still feel like it was my fault. And as much as it's tempting to jump in and say, well, no, that can actually push people away from getting help. So we want to meet people where they are and start there. So one of the things that people typically ask me when I do this talk or talks like it are, so how are we supposed to read the Bible with all of this really difficult, hard, disturbing material in it? So for a long time, I was just sort of like, I don't know. But then I realized that I needed to actually find something to share. So this is kind of a process I've developed for dealing with these really difficult texts. And if we had more time, I would take you through this process with a sort of sample text. But today I want to leave room for questions. So I'm just going to share my process, and then I will ask for this PowerPoint to be made available to you all. So if this is something you want to practice on your own, you are more than welcome to. So when I'm encountering a text that I just know is a really difficult one, I read the text really slowly and carefully. often maybe even multiple times. And the first thing I do is just notice the responses that my body has to this text and my emotions. So at this point, this might be kind of a different approach for many of us who have learned methods of Bible study where we're paying a lot of attention to the literature and history and social context. All that stuff is important and will come later. But at this point, I'm just paying attention to what does this do to me? And if we're doing this exercise in a group, we can ask each other, what were you feeling? What did you notice in your body when we were reading this text? Did you feel some tightness in your shoulders, or was your heart going faster? What was happening with you? So the first step is reading slowly and carefully. The second step is acknowledging. This has to come before any kind of explaining. What is the harm that occurs in this text, or what harm has occurred in its interpretation? Why would this be a painful scripture for someone to read? So maybe you haven't experienced the type of trauma that the text is talking about. That's okay. I'm happy for you if you haven't. But this is an opportunity to expand our empathy, because not everyone will feel the same thing with every text. But if my neighbor is struggling with the text and is experiencing pain with this text or the way that our church has read it, then I'm responsible for my neighbor as well. I need to have empathy for my neighbor. So we're going to acknowledge the harm in this text and in its interpretation. The next step is what I call interrogate. I want to pay attention to what are the power dynamics in this text. Who's in charge? Who is powerless? One way of getting at this is who is speaking in this text and who is quiet. What else is going on? Are there aspects of the historical or social situation that would help me to understand this better? And that does not mean that understanding does not diminish the harm, but rather helps us to try and understand what's simply going on in this already harmful situation. So then the last step that I think really helps us to reclaim these biblical texts is what I call respond. And in this step, I invite participants to say something back to the text. Is there anything you would want to say back to the text, the characters, or even to God? And recently when I was giving this talk, someone suggested, what if God spoke back to this text? What do you think God would like to say about this text? If God is loving and just and merciful, what do you think God has to say about this? And that kind of leads me to the final question. What could we reclaim, if anything, from this text? So normally when I have time, we go through the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we sort of experiment with this process and see how it works for us. But today, since I know our time is coming to an end, I'd like to just stop here for now. Uh-oh. Someone is getting featured in a way they may not want to be. So I'd love to take some time and just see if there are any questions or comments or responses. I'm also fine with rebuttals. So really any of the above. Yes, sir.
This topic was recently in the news with the behavior of some recent leaders in Christianity Today.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Any comment on that?
Oh, yes. So a woman that I personally know was involved in this, and it sounds very reminiscent of these kinds of patterns of abuses of power and systemic issues with lack of accountability that just make these things so pervasive and problematic. I know in Ontario, these past 2 weeks, there's just been so much. I know in Ontario, the Meeting House Church, which is kind of a neo-Anabaptist organization, released a statement too about their pastor. And the pastor, Brooks C. Cavey, I believe is his name, is this very prominent sort of Anabaptist leader. And in his apology, unfortunately, he failed to name what he did as abuse, even as he was confessing for adultery. And I think it's just so pervasive. It's heartbreaking. And I wish that I often wish that I could stop making this presentation because it wouldn't be relevant anymore. But sadly, that is not the moment that we are in. It's so pervasive. Yes, sir.
Governor Hirschberger. I grew up North Dakota,
Oh, wow.
and not that has a lot to do with it, except that my family in which I was born were kind of against education.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm an outlier. I mean, I did when I
Yeah.
went on into higher education, and particularly went into painting as an abstract.
Wow, how cool.
I got way out of mine.
Wow.
But back to the point you were raising, it seemed to me that that reflect back the church leaders and the bishop in particular was always concerned more about the women than us.
Oh my goodness, yes.
He was checking their sleeve lengths and that sort of thing, you know.
Yeah.
The dress.
Mm-hmm.
You got boots on, but they would notice that.
Right.
Notice whatever, it wasn't the right thing.
Yeah.
He felt free to comment, and he would quote scripture. And so, and you went over some of that. Now I see where he got his ideas.
And isn't that so troubling that the Bible has things that can be used in that way, right?
The bishop would say, well, you got to read the Bible more. And so the guy was up to speed. And if I did, and my father used to always have these morning readings, it seems like it was an imbalance.
Yeah.
That I noticed way back then because I had 5 sisters
Wow.
who were critical.
Yeah.
They kept asking these questions and being annoying.
Yeah.
And the only thing that the bishop noticed about us guys was our tie, whether it was too bright. You should wear more brown and
Yeah. And thank you so much. You have so aptly demonstrated the double standard and how I think sort of the implicit message that girls and women can get from that kind of critical examination of them is if something does happen to me, it must have been because my dress was too short or I had done X, Y, and Z, whereas the men are not being held accountable for their behavior. It's interesting how rarely Jesus's words of if your eye causes you to stumble, throw it out or tear it out or something are used. Like, what if we were quoting that alongside? But yes, I think it's so important because these people are getting these things from the Bible. We need to talk about what's our hermeneutic, what's our principle of interpretation that allows us to make sense of all of these things. And if Jesus is the full demonstration of what God is like, then we have to know that all of these things, these abuses of power are outside of the will of God. I think I might be over time, but I am more than happy to stick around. I have some copies of my book if you would like to take a look. And thank you all so much for having me today.
Thank you.